Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Raj Kumar. I'm the president and editor-in-chief of DevX, and I'm delighted to be with all of you who are here in the room live in Davos, and those of you who are following us from around the world for this issue brief on the state of the humanitarian system. In fact, the official title is The Humanitarian System Under Pressure, and I think maybe there hasn't been such an understatement in a long time. This is a case where humanitarians that I talk to and that we report on and look into around the world, if you talk to them, they will give you a sense that they have never felt so stretched before. Their institutions feel overwhelmed. You may not know that from your watching the news and the mainstream media, because there are some very big crises which get a lot of attention, but there are many, many more that don't, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. You may know, though, that the world is in this state of growing humanitarian crisis simply from where you live. Even if you live in an advanced economy in a rich country, you may find refugees in your own country. You may talk to them and hear their stories. And people at historic levels are fleeing. They're moving. They're moving sometimes internally because of conflict. They're moving because of climate. They're moving because of corruption, because of violence. There are many reasons, but there are many people moving. And today there are 360 million people in the world in need of humanitarian assistance, and over 100 million that are displaced from their homes for some reason. I'm joined by three people who are working at some of the most important institutions that are trying to address these issues, to provide assistance to people in need around the world. And we're going to hear from them what they think the picture is in 2024. Going forward. So I'm joined by Filippo Grandi, who is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. You may know it as UNHCR. I'm joined next to him by Kitty van der Heyden, who's the Deputy Executive Director for Partnerships at UNICEF, and David Miliband, who's the President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee. Maybe I'll just start with you, David, if I can. When you look at 2024, you think about the state of the humanitarian system, such as it is. How would you describe it now versus where we've been these past years? What's new? What's different? What's coming that people should be aware of?
Thanks. First of all, I think we all three would insist that while there is pressure in the humanitarian system or sector, the pressure on our clients is quantumly different. And what will run through my remarks is the unspeakable pressure that is afflicting 300 million plus people that you talked about. Just for context, we've just published our emergency watch list for 2024. 85% of the people who need humanitarian aid are in just 20 countries. 75% of the world's refugees are in those 20 countries. So it's a massive problem, but it's also acute in particular places. You had a session, I know, at WEF today on Gaza just before I arrived. Gaza is number 2 on our watch list. Number 1 is Sudan, and number 3 is South Sudan. And 25 million people in need, in humanitarian need in Sudan. I would say there are 3 sources of pressure in the humanitarian sector. There's a funding gap, there's a delivery gap, and there's a political gap. The funding gap is easy to talk about and actually easy to fix, relatively speaking. So I'm not going to spend time.
We're going to want to know about that later, but please go.
It's not as a policy problem. Funding is a much easier thing to fix than the second, which is delivery gap. How, in the context of conflict, is it possible to deliver humanitarian aid in a way that gets the aid to people who need it, is able to establish sustainable basis for them to live, not just under humanitarian aid, not on humanitarian aid, but off their own efforts, and in some cases, when they're in conflict, how to survive impunity that is all around them. And so that delivery gap has led us to work very hard in the context of the challenges of climate and conflict and poverty to propose different models for the international system to work with international NGOs and with local NGOs. We think civil society has a much bigger role to play than is currently afforded, and we're happy to talk about that some more. The political gap is obvious, and is obviously the hardest to fix, and takes us beyond the lanes that we're most comfortable with, but it wouldn't do justice to the topic not to recognize the West versus the rest as an increasing factor in global politics. the increasing breaking of international norms and in some cases laws about protection of civilians, about aid for civilians. So those political issues are summed up by the inertia and the gridlock at UN and Security Council level. Just to finish, and because I know you want this to be interactive, we're pleading with people in this week in Davos to remember 3 numbers. And they're numbers about solutions that we're pioneering, not problems that we're describing. Number 1, we took an approach to treating malnutrition to Mali. At the moment, 80% of acutely malnourished kids in the world don't get help. 27,000 kids were helped by our simplified protocol delivered by community health workers in Mali. 92% success rate, 20 to 30% savings on cost effectiveness. Second, 11 weeks, the second number that I want us to remember. 11 weeks is the time it took for children engaged in our Alan Simsim early childhood development program to make a year's worth of pre-primary progress in their social and emotional and academic progress. So there's we all know that education is the least funded part of the humanitarian sector. There are solutions even in that area as well. And then the third statistic is 15 countries in which we're running something called Signpost, which is a refugee for refugee information system. It's currently being used by over 50 million refugees because information is the first thing that you need, and it's a bespoke local initiative. It's actually unbranded, and it's a trusted source of information. That's just to say that I'm sure my co-panelists here can speak about the amazing things that their organizations are doing. Let's not allow ourselves to drown just in the dysfunction. Let's also think about how we can invest and seek investment in what is functional.
Yeah, I'm glad you proposed some solutions. We'll get a little more into that. But just in terms of this year, Kitty, you've been in the space a long time, and it seems like the trajectory year after year has been clear. More conflict, climate having a bigger impact. You know, so I guess if we're here next year, it seems like this trajectory is clear, unless maybe we can get some of the 3 areas that David proposed to change. What is your take on what 2024 is going to look like? What should people who are interested in this space look out for in 2024?
Look, I think if the past predicts where we're going, then what we've seen is an increased number of crises that are affecting children worldwide. Many of these crises are not sudden onset crises. Many of them are protracted. 80% of them are protracted. Look at Syria, 12 years of conflict. Look at Yemen, 9 years. Look at DRC, almost 30 years. These crises are not always black swans. They've been there for a long time, and we have, as a global community, not been effective in addressing them. What I see, if I look forward, is a continuation of those type of protracted crises, also because climate change as an undercurrent to those crises is not going away anytime soon. Actually, we may be winning some wars, some battles, but we're losing the war on climate currently. Where I see a huge problem coming up, and it's been there for a long time, and this is, thank God, we needed some disagreement in the room, right? Is an issue around funding. Because I think funding should be easy to fix. The reality is that it isn't. What I'm saying is not necessarily that there isn't enough money. What I'm saying is that almost all that money is earmarked and going to a few crises in this world. So as a humanitarian sector, last year, 2023, 50% of the funding went to 5 crises. Right? Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Syria, and refugees from Syria in other places, Ukraine, and Ukrainian refugees elsewhere. 50%. How many children does anybody know how many children in Sudan? You mentioned Sudan. How many children in Sudan need humanitarian assistance? Any guess? 13 million. Right? 80% not funded. Nobody talks about a place like Burkina Faso. 3.2 million people need humanitarian assistance. 91% not funded. So we are looking at a crisis within a crisis. We see increasing needs and a chronic underfunding and a funding that is very, very earmarked to what hits the headlines And that leads to an inability of all of us together as a humanitarian system to deliver in an equitable way. Every child, every civilian has a right to survive and to thrive. And currently as a system, we're not enabled to deliver that. Last point I want to make, when it comes to funding, what we see, because there are so many crises and that's only increasing, and we need that life-saving support. But it is also leading to a much reduced portfolio within one fixed budget, which is ODA, development aid, into addressing the root causes of some of these crises: education, health systems, basic services that people depend on for a life in dignity. The more we do humanitarian aid, if that is within one fixed funding envelope, the less we're able to deal with the root causes of deprivation and displacement, of human misery and migration. With that, I think we get to refugees. Over to you.
That is a good segue to refugees. Filippo, people are moving. People are moving. There are refugees all over the world now, and your agency is responsible for serving them in many, many places. So in many cases, these are people who have left home as refugees a very long time ago, to Kitty's point about protracted crises. In many cases, they are not getting the level of assistance that would be required that your agency would like to give them, so there's a funding aspect there too. But what is the big picture when you look at 2024 and the status of refugees?
I'm actually lucky that I can build on what my co-panelists have already said. So I'll add a few comments, a bit also from my perspective. The first one, and I don't know, I think this is also related to what David mentioned, the crisis of delivery. We spoke about this before in other panels, in fact. One of the big issues, this is nothing really new, but new at the scale at which it's happening, is the politicization of the responses. And this has a very wide range of phenomena, of aspects. Of course, in my area, in our area, it's very clear. Politicization of refugee movements for electoral purposes is common. This actually makes delivery much more difficult, because solutions that often are easy to find are made impossible by the politics.
Things like giving a work permit to a refugee.
Right, and we just had another meeting here on the same topic, and this came up. But also the issue of access, because the traditional understanding, always difficult, but that humanitarians talk to everybody and must have access everywhere, is now often put in discussion. No, you cannot talk to these people because they're bad, and some donors drive that discussion. So this is an important aspect of the crisis in the humanitarian domain. The other aspect is resources. And I agree with what has been said. And the key question here is, I often hear this comment: humanitarian assistance has grown over the decades, has ballooned, in fact, because there were many needs. Has it peaked? I think it's a bit of an absurd question, because if you talk about just the UN, but the UN appeals, are a big chunk, 30, 40 billion a year? This is small change in the world today. And how can you say that it has peaked when it is important to save so many lives? But let's assume it has peaked, and let's assume also that one of the reasons why it has peaked, as is often said, in my opinion, in a manner that distracts from the real discussion, which is the responsibility of not having it peak. But often it's, the humanitarian model is so broken that we cannot put more money into it. I think this is a false argument, not least because actually the humanitarian model is evolving. I come to Davos every year, I always hear this mantra: we need to have a new humanitarian. The humanitarian model, we've all evolved enormously in terms of efficiency, in terms of partnering to making this more sustainable. And we just, Kitty just mentioned that. So I think we need to recognize that and scale it up. These new models where we work with development organizations, where we look at sustainability, at sustainable care, as I call it. And this brings me to my last point, which is the importance in a world that is so fraught with crisis of emphasizing not only humanitarian responses, but searching for solutions. Because we also know that the more you delay solutions, from climate change to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, areas in which the world has been brilliant at, pretending, or putting it aside for a variety of reasons, then it comes back with a vengeance in different ways, right? So that is one track of discussion. The other track for us, final point I want to make is, what do we do in the absence of solutions, be they political solutions or developmental solutions or both, like in the case of climate? And I think that there is where we need to become even better at finding intermediate approaches where, again, support to those that pay the price of this crisis is sustainable and does not depend entirely on humanitarian assistance. That's a difficult one, but I think that that's one, in terms of delivery, where we need to really work. We are working on that, but we need to really get more support and more space in order for, because I predict that necessity to find intermediate, not even solution, but intermediate ways to support people in distress without a solution that would allow them to go back to normality, that situation is becoming the new normal almost everywhere.
Well, humanitarian assistance may not have peaked, but perhaps official development assistance has. Perhaps ODA, which is the larger basket from which humanitarian aid comes, has. We don't know, but if you look at this year, and 60% of the world has elections, and many donor countries are moving more and more rightward, and candidates are winning who are opposed to official development assistance, perhaps that basket, a larger percentage, ends up going to the humanitarian community, given the crises and the needs. But the overall basket may itself be shrinking or plateaued. But I want to come back to a key point you made, Filippo, and bring David into the discussion on this. And by the way, in a moment, I'm going to ask for questions from the audience if you have them. On this question of, has the humanitarian system evolved? Is it getting better? Has the model changed? Filippo says yes. Obviously, there are things like cash transfers that IRC has been a big proponent of. You do quite a lot of that kind of work, and it's expanded in many agencies now. What is the fair assessment from your standpoint, David, given that you're not new to this space, you've been here a while, but you are a relative newcomer in that you had an important political job before you took this one?
You're such a charmer. You almost said I was still young, so you almost had me. Look, I think it's a very low bar to say, is it getting better? Because it could be crawling forward. The point is there still a long way to go to make it much, 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 much better? Yes. So I would defend what's done, but I would argue there's a long way to go to make it, to make the money go further.
Would you put a grade on the humanitarian system?
No, but I wasn't born yesterday, so and I spent a lot of years dodging questions like that. But I think it's important to be clear. There are interventions that we know work very well, but are seriously underfunded. I mean, early childhood development is an example of that. Malnutrition is another example of that. So that's really inexcusable. Secondly, we also know that the poorest places get the least investment. And one example of that is in the climate adaptation space. This is going to be a major new area of funding. We know the Secretary General has a decision rule that 50% of all climate, Secretary General of the UN, 50% of all climate funding should go to adaptation. We say that it's essential that a proportionate amount of that funding goes to fragile and conflict states, which at the moment get the least. And within those fragile and conflict states, a fixed percentage at least goes through the civil society sector, because we know that institutions like the World Bank historically have only worked through the official sovereign sector. You can't do that in a fragile and conflict states. So that's an example of how delivery has to move forward. Thirdly, you'd have to say that we're going backwards on civilian protection and on access to humanitarian aid, and that those two areas are legal rights to be protected from war. 90% of the casualties of war today are civilians, and the access, quote-unquote access, it's sort of strangulation rather than access. The limitations on humanitarian aid delivery are growing, not receding.
So if you were to measure by outcomes, it sounds like, at least in certain areas, we are doing worse than we were before as a humanitarian
There are
system.
more people in humanitarian need. I mean, Filippo can tell you that the number of refugees and displaced people has doubled. Some of them, like from Ukrainian refugees in Europe, are getting high standards of treatment, but very large swathe of them are getting very low standards of treatment.
Let's see if we have a question or two from the audience. I see Sarah there. I'd like to go to her, the woman in red, and then we'll take one of the questions in the front row. We'll take three if we can keep them really brief and snappy, with ideally a question mark at the end. And please share your name and organization if you would.
Thanks, Raj. I'm Sara Pantriano from ODI. Short and snappy. Kitty talked about Sudan. What we're seeing in Sudan is an enormous amount of leadership and energy by Sudanese citizens themselves. In a lot of areas where there is no access, it is the Sudanese who are responding to the crisis, either loosely, organized in forms of mutual aid or through the emergency rooms. How can we sustain these forms of very impactful, very appropriate, adequate, response to make sure that first they get more money, second they're more involved in the decision making around the response?
Very good. You can pass it right behind you. We'll take your question and then come back to the front row.
Thank you. I'm Iqbal. I'm a global shaper from Kabul Hub, Afghanistan. One side of the coin is you guys talking about lack of funding, but the other challenge that has persistently existed in Afghanistan, and when it comes to aid distribution, is the aid not going to the right people because the regime hands over, a pre-picked list to the UN organizations to distribute the aid. So whereas it starts from a really good place with goodwill for the aid, but it doesn't reach the right people. A recent example is Ghor province, where the aid was completely stopped because the regime was interfering. What are the mechanisms? How can you make sure that the aid makes it to the right people?
Thank you for that question. Just right here in the front row, if we can pass the mic. Go ahead.
Hi. Hello. My name is Antonella, and I really related to what Kita said because I come from a country where it's in crisis that no one talks about anymore. However, we're the second worst migration crisis in the world. So I think you can guess this correctly. So I come from Venezuela, and my question is very simple, but I have to ask, why are we the second least funded humanitarian crisis in the world?
Well, Kitty, maybe we'll start with you on this question from Antonella about Venezuela. And again, we have just a few minutes, so we'll try to keep our responses sharp if we can. Venezuelan refugees are now all over the world. Why is it not a place that gets a lot of funding?
Look, if I would know the answer, we would have the funding we needed to address the crisis in Venezuela and in surrounding countries, right? I mean, this is not a UN problem. We are being funded by donors. And unfortunately, as I said, those donors create highly earmarked funding pathways for us. And that is creating, I mean, you mentioned it, it's an equity crisis in the way we fund the humanitarian crisis. We are the custodians on the convention. Every child is the same, whether you're in Venezuela or in Gaza or in Ukraine or in Yemen, doesn't matter. Every child has the same rights. And we're unable to be there for every child everywhere all the time, because the way we're funded as a system means we're there for some children in some countries for some part of the time. That is the equity crisis we're dealing with. That is something that our donors need to help us solve. We can't do this alone. We will be advocating for every forgotten crisis, every forgotten child is a crisis for us.
Filippo, embedded in Sarah's question is a critique, I think. You talked a bit about the delivery getting better in some ways, but she's talking really about this idea of localization, right? And such a small percentage of humanitarian assistance gets to local organizations. She's using the case of Sudan to say, look, here's a place where people are rising up on their own to do this work. Why can't we as an international system fund them? What is the barrier? Is it bureaucratic intransigence? Is it a different view of how trustworthy local organizations are? What's holding us back from truly increasing the amount of humanitarian aid that goes to local organizations?
But before I answer Sarah's question, just one point on Venezuela. It's a bit more of a mixed picture. In a place like Colombia, and this is what I was referring earlier, that we need to look at how these things are evolving. Colombia is the country hosting the largest number of Venezuelans, right? 2.5 million, probably more, close to 3 million now. So it's a large number. We started off a few years back with a very humanitarian approach. Money dried up very quickly. You're absolutely right on that, because this was not a priority, et cetera, et cetera. But in Colombia in particular, to an extent in Ecuador and other places as well, are probably some of the countries where involving international financial institutions, the Inter-American Development Bank, even the World Bank, in support of good state policies that include refugees, has been one of the most successful. And we're talking about billions of dollars. So you see, I think that we need to look at it. If there is pressure on us to embrace new models, and we do embrace new models because we are largely, the humanitarians are largely responsible for having brought in development actors, then this needs to be recognized and supported. Otherwise, we continue. It's a spiral. It's a negative spiral that we never get out of. Humanitarian dries up, earmarking. These are all real issues, but there are ways out that I think we need to grow. And on Sarah's, I think this is an important point. We are struggling with that as an organization. We are grappling with it as an organization. At the last refugee forum, in December, last month, we had 300 refugees participating. So that was still symbolic, if you wish, over 4,000 participants, but a powerful symbol that they are part of the discussion. This is, in a way, indirectly responding what you said about Sudan. The question is, I did one of the final sessions with 4 of them. It was fascinating because I had to push back on certain issues. Representation, for example. How do you determine who represents what? The point I sent back to them when they said, we want to be more part of this meeting, we want to be part of your governance structure, the message back is, this is all well and good, but because it's so difficult to structure it globally, it's at the local level that this needs to happen, and this is what you're saying. So I am now pushing my representatives in the field to embrace refugee participation in decision-making. It's still difficult because, representation is political at every level. Who does what? To whom do you entrust resources to do things? It's not a joke. It's quite complicated. But it's easier to do it at the local level where you have a better picture of the situation, and it's actually much more effective to do it at the local level. It's a very, very big discussion, but one that I think deserves attention and deserves experiments in order to move, because we have seen it during COVID, and we see it in this impossible situation where access is almost zero or next to zero, that either you work with the local community or you don't work.
And it's potentially one of the most important ways to do more with less when you have limited humanitarian
we need to
funds.
find the right ways to do it, because otherwise donors will start saying, wait a minute, where is this money going?
Right.
Because there is also that element that we need to factor in.
David, we only have about a minute or so left, but we had this colleague in Afghanistan.
Yep. So 2 things to end up. 30 seconds on the funding picture. In broad terms, half of the world's extreme poor live in fragile and conflict states, but a quarter of the money that is earmarked for development and humanitarian aid together goes. So you've got a mismatch there. There's big room for a switch spend, not least because we now know, 30, 40 years after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, there is a route to development in stable states that is about governance and markets, not about international aid. To the colleague in Afghanistan, we have 5,000 people working for the International Rescue Committee in Afghanistan at local level in 12 different provinces, including 2,200 women, despite the quote-unquote ban that was imposed. And your point about thinking local is actually borne out by every study of where aid has gone in Afghanistan. Filippo has an extraordinarily distinguished record, actually, in Afghanistan, knows more about it than I do, but for 20 or 30 years. But all of the studies show the big money that goes in for prestige infrastructure projects from the top doesn't get to the people who need it. Seeding change at local level does. And that's a very important message. We think we're part of the local system because of our 5,000 staff, 4,996 are Afghans. And they make decisions about what to do and which grants to apply for. So I think your point is an important one.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think part of what our colleague in Afghanistan was getting at is it's also about having to work with certain governments. You talked about the governments in fragile states that are very challenging to work with. The reality this year is there are many governments, many countries that are tough partners for the humanitarian community, but there's no choice because, as Kitty says, that's where the need is. So I hope we've given you a lay of the land for what is a very challenging moment for the humanitarian community, and as David said, especially for the people themselves who are in need all over the world. So thank you very much for being a part of the issue briefing today.